mansion felt colder without Gregory. It wasn't the actual temperature. California winters never dropped far enough to justify the heavy wool coats in the closet, but rather the absence of his presence that seemed to drain the warmth from every corner of our sprawling home. For 5 years, this estate had been a symbol of everything Gregory had given me. A life of luxury, privilege, and stability. Yet tonight, with Gregory lying in a hospital bed miles away, the polished floors and high ceilings felt like the walls of a gilded cage. Gregory wasn't just wealthy. He was a self-made billionaire. He often told the story of how he started his first business out of his car. A tale he never tired of recounting, though I had memorized every detail. "I built my empire brick by brick," he would say, a gleam in his eyes as he swirled his whiskey. "And when I saw you, I knew I'd found my queen to sit beside me on this throne." It was flattering at first, being the object of his admiration, the younger woman he'd chosen to share his carefully curated world. I was 35 when we married, half his age. Our wedding was an extravagant affair. A private ceremony in Tuscany, followed by a week of celebrations with the kind of people who spoke in whispers about hedge funds, mergers, and acquisitions. Gregory made sure every detail was perfect. From the custom gown flown in from Paris to the rare vintage champagne he had imported just for the occasion. "You deserve the best," he said with a proud smile as he toasted me that night. "And I'll give you everything." And he did. The sprawling estate, with its manicured gardens and glittering infinity pool, became my home. Trips to the Amalfi Coast, Paris, and Tokyo were frequent enough to feel routine. Gregory lavished me with gifts. A diamond necklace just because, an art piece from a gallery opening in New York, and designer gowns that I rarely had the chance to wear. For a while, I told myself I was happy. Why wouldn't I be? My friends from my old life, the boutique I used to own. The tiny apartment I adored for its charm despite its peeling paint marveled at my good fortune. "You're living the dream," one of them said when I visited her after the wedding, her tone tinged with envy. And I believed it. Gregory was kind, attentive, and generous. But the dream came with a cost. After we returned from our honeymoon, Gregory gently suggested I close my boutique. "You've worked hard enough, darling," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You should enjoy life now. Travel, relax, focus on yourself." At first, I resisted. That boutique had been my pride and joy, a reflection of my creativity and independence. I had built it from scratch, sourcing unique pieces from small designers and creating a space that felt like home for my customers. But Gregory was persuasive and his argument made sense. I didn't need the income, and with him traveling so often for business, it seemed logical to have the freedom to join him whenever I pleased. "You'll love the time to explore new passions," he said, flashing the smile that always seemed to disarm me. Reluctantly, I agreed, convincing myself that I could find other ways to channel my energy. Instead, I found myself with endless time and no purpose. The days stretched long, filled with personal trainers, spa appointments, and charity luncheons where women in designer dresses competed over whose husband had the bigger yacht. I learned to navigate this world, to smile at the right people, and to nod politely during conversations about tax havens and art auctions. But the more I immersed myself in Gregory's universe, the more I felt like an outsider in my own life. Gregory didn't notice. He was busy, always busy. His work consumed him, even more so after his health began to falter. At 70, he refused to slow down, convinced that his empire would crumble if he took his foot off the pedal for even a moment. "It's all for us," he would say when I begged him to take a vacation. "For our future." But what future? We didn't have children, a choice Gregory had made clear early in our relationship. "I'm too old to start a family now," he'd said, and I'd agreed at the time, telling myself that I didn't need children to be fulfilled. But as the years passed, I began to wonder if I had made that decision for myself or for him. Our evenings together grew predictable. Gregory would come home late, exhausted but eager to share the details of his day. I would listen, offering words of encouragement, even as my mind wandered. When we entertained guests, he would proudly introduce me as the love of my life, a phrase that always made me smile despite the hollowness it began to carry. I was his queen, his trophy, his perfect partner. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being myself. The turning point came subtly, like a crack in a dam. Gregory's health had been declining for months, though he refused to acknowledge it. When he finally collapsed during a meeting, his doctor insisted he be hospitalized for observation. I visited him every day, sitting by his bedside and holding his hand as he recounted stories from his youth. He looked so vulnerable, so unlike the powerful man I had married, that it stirred a wave of guilt I couldn't quite place. But when I left the hospital each evening, a strange restlessness crept over me. For the first time in years, I felt unmoored, free from the routines and expectations that had defined my life with Gregory. The mansion that had once seemed so grand now felt oppressive, its opulence a stark reminder of everything I had sacrificed. I wandered the halls aimlessly, pausing in front of the grand piano I never learned to play, the library filled with books I'd never had time to read. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit the truth. I was lonely. That night, I slipped on a simple coat and left the house without telling anyone. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to breathe, to escape the weight of my carefully constructed life. As I walked past cafes and bars, their warm lights spilling onto the sidewalks, I felt a pang of longing for a life I'd left behind. A life where I wasn't Gregory's wife but simply me. The park was quiet, the cool night air biting at my cheeks. I found a bench and sat down, staring at the city skyline in the distance. I hadn't planned anything, but in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Freedom. It was there, under the faint glow of the streetlights, that I saw him for the first time. It wasn't supposed to happen again. That's what I told myself after that first meeting with Luke in the park. It had been innocent enough, just two strangers exchanging light conversation on a quiet evening. But as I walked back to the mansion that night, I couldn't shake the memory of his smile or the warmth of his voice. It lingered, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, and it frightened me almost as much as it thrilled me. The following night, I found myself restless, pacing the halls of the house as the hours stretched endlessly. Gregory's absence was a void I didn't know how to fill. The staff moved silently around me, as though they were trying not to disturb the delicate balance of my thoughts. Finally, unable to bear the stillness any longer, I slipped out of the house and found myself walking the same path I had the night before. I told myself it was just a walk, nothing more. But when I reached the park and saw Luke jogging again, I realized I'd been lying to myself. My heart quickened as he spotted me and slowed to a stop, removing one earbud and grinning. "Evening," he said, just like the night before, his tone friendly but curious. "Back again." I nodded, feeling uncharacteristically shy. "It's nice here. Quiet." He gestured to the bench I'd sat on the previous night. "Mind if I join you for a bit? My legs could use a break." And just like that, we were talking again. This time, the conversation came easier, flowing naturally as though we'd known each other for longer than the two brief encounters. He told me more about his work, how he was a freelance graphic designer trying to establish himself. There was an energy about him, a sense of purpose and possibility that felt intoxicatingly foreign to me. He didn't talk about the weight of responsibility or the demands of maintaining an empire. He talked about passion, creativity, and chasing dreams. That second meeting turned into a third, then a fourth. Each time I told myself it would be the last, that I wouldn't go back to the park again. And yet, every evening, I found myself drawn there, pulled by a force I couldn't explain. I began to crave the way Luke looked at me, with genuine interest, unclouded by assumptions or expectations. To him, I wasn't Gregory's wife or the mistress of a sprawling estate. I was just a woman, mysterious and new, someone he wanted to know more about. At first, I tried to keep our conversations light, but Luke had a way of asking questions that drew me out of myself. He wanted to know about my favorite places to travel, my childhood memories, the books I loved to read. He noticed small details, how I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, how my eyes lit up when I talked about art. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. But with each meeting, a growing unease settled in my chest. I was married. I was Gregory's wife. I shouldn't have been sitting on a park bench at night with a man who wasn't my husband, laughing at his jokes and losing myself in the warmth of his gaze. Yet I couldn't stop. As our conversations deepened, so did my thoughts. They became tangled with questions I couldn't bring myself to answer. What if I told Luke the truth? What if I told him I wasn't free, that I had a husband lying in a hospital bed? Would he turn away from me, disgusted by the deceit? Or would he stay, tempted by the same spark that had begun to consume me? One night, as we walked through the park together, Luke suddenly stopped and turned to face me. "I don't know why, but I feel like I've known you forever," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "There's something about you." My breath caught in my throat. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. His words were dangerously close to the ones I'd been avoiding in my own mind. I felt it too, that undeniable pull between us, the kind of connection that seemed too powerful to ignore. Scared me, but it also awakened something in me I thought I'd lost forever. I didn't answer him. Instead, I changed the subject, laughing nervously as I steered the conversation back to something safe. But later that night, as I lay awake in the mansion's cavernous bedroom, his words echoed in my mind. "There's something about you." Over the next few weeks, our meetings became more frequent. Luke started texting me during the day, sending playful messages or pictures of things he thought I'd find funny. I saved his number under a fake name in my phone and turned off notifications to avoid suspicion. My carefully constructed life with Gregory felt like a fragile glass house, and I was throwing stones at it with reckless abandon. The thought of betraying Gregory crept into my mind more often now, no longer an abstract fear but a real possibility. I began to imagine what it would be like to let myself go completely, to give in to the growing tension between Luke and me. My dreams were filled with fleeting touches and stolen kisses, scenarios that left me breathless when I woke. I knew it was wrong. I knew I was crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But the temptation was overwhelming, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. Gregory's world felt cold and distant, a place where I was expected to be perfect and poised at all times. With Luke, I could be raw and real, stripped of the expectations that had weighed me down for years. One evening, as we sat on the same bench where we'd first met, Luke reached out and took my hand. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure if I'd pull away. I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "Tell me something real," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something you haven't told anyone." I hesitated, my mind racing. The truth sat heavy on my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I offered a carefully curated piece of myself, enough to keep him intrigued but far from the whole story. As he looked into my eyes, I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble. I was falling, and I didn't know how to stop. The first time I lied to Gregory, the words slipped out so easily, it surprised even me. "I have a meeting downtown about a charity event," I said, smoothing the collar of my blouse as I stood in front of the mirror. Gregory, frail but sharp as ever, was sitting up in his hospital bed, his tablet in hand. He didn't even look up. Distracted by emails, he refused to stop answering despite his worsening condition. "That's good," he said absent-mindedly. "Keep busy. It's important to have something to focus on." I hesitated for a split second, guilt rippling through me, but then he glanced up, his eyes softening. "You've been amazing, coming here every day. Don't think I haven't noticed." His words stung. I smiled faintly, kissed him on the forehead, and left the hospital with my stomach twisting in knots. But by the time I reached my car, my pulse had quickened. Not with guilt, but with anticipation. The meeting, of course, didn't exist. Instead, I drove to a small bistro tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Luke was already there, sitting at a table by the window, his easy smile lighting up as soon as he saw me. I felt a rush of something I couldn't name, excitement, danger, and the thrill of being someone else, even for just a little while. As the days turned into weeks, the lies grew easier. I told Gregory the first had meetings, errands, or last-minute charity events. He never questioned me. Why would he? I'd always been the perfect wife, and he had no reason to suspect otherwise. Each time I left the hospital, my heart beat a little faster, my thoughts racing ahead to what I would say, how I would explain myself if someone caught me. But no one did. Luke and I began meeting more frequently, always in places carefully chosen to keep our encounters private. Small cafes, quiet parks, and once, an art gallery where we wandered through the exhibits like two strangers who had just happened to strike up a conversation. I didn't tell him about Gregory, and he never asked. To him, I was just a woman who had walked into his life by chance, unattached and free. The shift in me was subtle at first. I started paying more attention to my appearance, spending extra time in front of the mirror before our dates. My wardrobe, once filled with conservative dresses and tailored suits meant to impress at charity events and social gatherings, began to change. I found myself drawn to the lingerie section of department stores, my fingers brushing over lace and silk as I imagined Luke's reaction to each piece. It became a secret ritual. I would slip out of the house under the guise of running errands and spend hours shopping for things I couldn't possibly wear in Gregory's world. Delicate bralettes, sheer stockings, and daring bodysuits found their way into my wardrobe, hidden at the back where no one would find them. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply indulging in something that made me feel good. But deep down, I knew I was dressing for Luke. I began to imagine what it would be like to reveal these hidden pieces to him. I pictured his hands, his gaze, the way he would look at me as though I were the only woman in the world. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a thrill that was both exhilarating and terrifying. With each passing day, the line between who I was and who I pretended to be blurred further. At the hospital, I played the devoted wife, holding Gregory's hand and nodding along as he talked about his plans for when he got better. But the moment I walked out of those doors, I shed that version of myself like an ill-fitting coat. Luke and I began to push boundaries. Our dates grew more intimate, the spaces between us shrinking as we lingered over coffee or walked along deserted streets. His touch became bolder, a hand on my lower back, a thumb brushing against my wrist. Each time, I felt myself unraveling a little more, giving in to the pull of something I couldn't resist. One evening, after a particularly long visit with Gregory, I found myself standing in my closet, staring at the rows of clothes that suddenly felt dull and lifeless. My gaze drifted to the back, to the small collection of lingerie I had been curating in secret. On a whim, I pulled out a black lace set, the kind of thing I would never have worn before. I tried it on, studying my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was almost unrecognizable, confident, daring, alive. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the rush of adrenaline that accompanied the thought of seeing Luke. That night, I told Gregory the first had a late meeting and slipped out of the house. When I arrived at the restaurant where Luke was waiting, his eyes widened slightly as he took in my appearance. "You look amazing," he said, his voice low and appreciative. I felt a surge of pride, a validation I hadn't realized I craved so deeply. As we sat down, I couldn't help but wonder how far I was willing to go, how much I was willing to risk for the way he made me feel. The thoughts of betrayal grew louder, harder to ignore. I found myself daydreaming about Luke, replaying our conversations and imagining what it would be like to let the distance between us disappear completely. At night, as I lay in bed beside Gregory's empty pillow, the fantasies became more vivid, more tangible. I knew I was playing with fire, but with every lie, every secret text, and every stolen moment, I edged closer to the flames, unable or perhaps unwilling to pull myself back. It was a warm evening when everything began to unravel, though at the time, I didn't know it yet. I was too wrapped up in the thrill of my secret life, too distracted by the rush of adrenaline that came with every meeting with Luke. For weeks, I had carefully balanced the two versions of myself. Gregory's devoted wife by day, and someone freer, riskier, and more alive by night. But that balance was becoming harder to maintain. Gregory's condition had worsened. The doctors were cautiously pessimistic now, avoiding eye contact when I asked about his prognosis. The guilt I'd been pushing to the back of my mind began to creep forward, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Still, even as I sat by his bedside, holding his hand and listening to his labored breathing, my mind wandered to Luke. That night, as I prepared to leave for what Gregory believed was another late charity meeting, I felt the weight of his gaze on me. "You've been running yourself ragged," he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You don't have to do everything, you know? You can take a break." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile as I smoothed my dress. "I like keeping busy." His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You're incredible," he whispered. "I don't deserve you." I froze, the words landing like a punch to the gut. My smile faltered, but I recovered quickly, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Rest?" I said softly, avoiding his gaze as I hurried out of the room. The streets were quiet as I drove toward the park where Luke was waiting. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. I had used Gregory's car again. I told myself it didn't matter, that the sleek black sedan was just a vehicle. But deep down, I knew it was another layer of recklessness, another crack in the fragile facade of my double life. When I pulled up to the park, Luke was leaning against a lamppost, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlight. He smiled as I stepped out of the car, his eyes lighting up in that way that always made my heart race. "Fancy ride?" he teased, nodding toward the car as I approached him. I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "It gets me where I need to go." We didn't linger in the park that night. Luke suggested we go somewhere more private, somewhere we could talk or not talk without worrying about prying eyes. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening as I glanced back at the car. The boundaries I had been so careful to maintain were slipping away, and I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. "Let's just drive," I said finally, unlocking the car with a click of the key fob. The atmosphere inside the car was charged with anticipation. Luke sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the center console, his fingers just barely grazing my arm. The tension was palpable, and it didn't take long for it to break. We parked in a secluded lot, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The world outside the car faded away as Luke leaned toward me, his hand brushing against my cheek. I didn't resist. In that moment, I wasn't Gregory's wife. I wasn't bound by the weight of my obligations or the guilt that had been haunting me. I was just a woman who wanted to feel alive. The leather seats creaked beneath us as the boundaries dissolved entirely. Every touch, every whispered word, every moment was seared into my memory. It was reckless and impulsive and everything I'd been craving. The next morning, I woke up feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, the way Luke had looked at me, the way it felt to let go completely. But as I drove Gregory's car back to the mansion, a nagging sense of dread began to creep in. I couldn't pinpoint why, but something felt off. I parked the car in its usual spot, brushing off the unease as paranoia. I had been careful. No one had seen us. The car was just a car, and the night was over. But what I didn't realize, what I hadn't even thought to consider, was the small device mounted discreetly on the dashboard. Gregory's car had a DVR system installed, a security feature he had insisted on for all his vehicles. I had forgotten all about it, its presence so mundane and unassuming that it hadn't even crossed my mind. The car had recorded everything. 2 days later, I was sitting in the library, flipping idly through a magazine, when Charles, Gregory's assistant, walked in. His expression was unusually serious, his posture stiff as he approached me. "Madam," he said, his voice formal but tinged with discomfort, "there's something I think you should see." I frowned, setting the magazine aside as he handed me a tablet. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood silently as I looked down at the screen. My blood ran cold. There it was, captured in crystal clear detail. The car's DVR footage of me and Luke, our betrayal recorded from start to finish. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, every second more damning than the last. I looked up at Charles, my face pale. "Where did you get this?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. It was flagged during routine maintenance on the car, he said quietly. The system uploads footage automatically for review. I couldn't speak. The walls of my carefully constructed double life were crashing down around me, and there was no way to stop it. That evening, Gregory found out. I don't know if Charles told him or if he saw the footage himself, but when I visited the hospital, the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. He wouldn't look at me. When I reached for his hand, he pulled it away, his expression a mixture of heartbreak and disgust. The guilt I had been avoiding came crashing down in full force. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now there was no hiding from the consequences. When Gregory turned his face away from me in the hospital, I knew the life I had built, the life he had given me, was over. His refusal to meet my gaze, the tension in his jaw, the silence that followed when I tried to speak, it was like a door slamming shut in my face. I stood by his bedside, awkward and unsure, the words I had rehearsed in my mind slipping away under the weight of his rejection. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking, but Gregory didn't respond. He simply turned his head toward the window, staring out at the city skyline, his expression carved from stone. After a moment, he shifted slightly, his hand weakly waving me away. "I think you should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The walk back to my car felt like the longest journey of my life. The heels of my shoes clicked against the polished hospital floors, each step echoing like a drumbeat of judgment. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was trembling. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly at the windshield. The guilt, the shame, the realization of what I had done, it all crashed down on me at once. The following days passed in a blur. Gregory's lawyer, Mr. Hadley, summoned me to his office almost immediately. I arrived dressed in one of my designer suits, a futile attempt to project composure and dignity. But as I sat across from him at his imposing mahogany desk, I felt anything but composed. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mr. Hadley began, his tone measured but icy, "I'm here to inform you that Mr. Caldwell is pursuing a divorce. Given the circumstances, he has instructed me to expedite the process." My throat tightened. Circumstances, I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach twisting into knots. Inside were printed screenshots from the car's DVR footage, accompanied by a summary of the evidence. It was all there: dates, times, locations. My betrayal catalogued with clinical precision. "This is..." I stammered, my voice barely audible. "This is humiliating." Mr. Hadley's expression didn't waver. "Mr. Caldwell was understandably devastated by your actions. He has requested that the divorce proceedings be as discreet as possible, but make no mistake, this will not end favorably for you." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said coolly, "that the prenuptial agreement you signed before your marriage will be enforced to the letter. You will leave this marriage with what you brought into it, which, as I understand, is minimal." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat back in the chair, my hands trembling. There must be something. I gave up everything for him. My career, my life. "You also betrayed him," he said, his tone unyielding. "Mr. Caldwell is within his rights to protect his assets." The golden cage I had once admired now felt like a tomb. The mansion, with its sprawling gardens and glittering chandeliers, had become a hollow, empty place. The staff moved around me with polite indifference, their smiles strained as if they already knew I wouldn't be there much longer. Every room felt colder, the walls pressing in on me as the reality of my situation set in. Luke, the man I had risked everything for, had been calling and texting since the discovery. At first, I ignored him, too consumed by my own spiraling despair to face him. But one evening, when the loneliness became unbearable, I answered the phone. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice hesitant. "Are you okay?" "Okay," I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "No, Luke, I'm not okay. My life is falling apart." "I didn't mean for..." "Don't," I interrupted. Don't say it wasn't your fault. I knew what I was doing. This is on me. He was silent for a moment, then asked, "Can I help? Is there anything I can do?" But what could he do? He was a struggling graphic designer with dreams of making it big someday. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't give me back the life I'd lost. And even if he could, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. "No," I said finally, my voice flat. "There's nothing anyone can do." The day Gregory's lawyer sent the final paperwork, I knew it was time to leave the mansion. I packed my belongings into a few suitcases, leaving behind the designer gowns, the jewelry, the remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. The staff avoided my eyes as I made my way to the door, their usual politeness tinged with pity. As I stepped outside, the reality of my situation hit me in full force. I had nowhere to go. My bank accounts were frozen, my connections in Gregory's world severed. The friends I had made during our marriage, the wives of his business partners, the socialites who had welcomed me into their circles, were conspicuously absent now. Without Gregory, I was no one. I found a small, dingy apartment on the outskirts of the city, a far cry from the opulence I had grown accustomed to. The walls were thin, the neighbors noisy, and the furnishings sparse. At night, as I lay on the lumpy mattress, I thought about Gregory, about the life I had thrown away for a fleeting moment of passion. I thought about Luke, whose calls I no longer answered, and the foolish hope I had clung to that he might somehow save me. But most of all, I thought about myself, the woman I had become, the choices I had made, and the emptiness I now carried. For years, I had lived in a gilded cage, telling myself it was enough, that I could find happiness in the luxury and security Gregory provided. But now, as I stared at the cracked ceiling of my tiny apartment, I realized the truth. The cage hadn't trapped me. I had trapped myself. And now, there was nothing left but the cold, hard reality of starting over, alone.